The next topic is spatial terms. Children's early word meaning are neither simply label for existing concept, which is the cognitive view, or constructed entirely because language requires, and that is the verb hypothesis view. Rather, they result from the interaction of existing cognitive development and the semantic categories of the input that they receive from the language. The, with regard to this, the important work that has been done was the one which has been known as the anthropology, published in 1996 by the name of Rethinking Linguistic Relativity. It was edited by Levinson and Gumpers, and they introduced the more social and cognitive aspects of linguistic relativity. Levinson documented significant linguistic relativity effects in the linguistic conceptualization of spatial categories across languages or between different languages. Now, the separate study was done by Bowerman, who looked at the role of language in the thought. And then we have Slobin, who basically focused on thinking for speaking aspect, where the idea was to look at the perceptual data and how that perceptual data is translated into linguistic forms to be used for communication purposes. So you have both views, and now with the light of that, we will see what spatial terms and how the spatial terms are discussed in the light of these studies. Here you have an image in front of you based on the study conducted by Bowerman and Choi. So the aspect of English you can see here, and then you have Koreans here. How do they use the concept with regard to, you can say, put on and put in? So we will discuss the two different variation or similarities which are there in two different contexts. They posed a different question with regard to them, and they discussed it's more like what came first, cognition or language. And they arrive at a view which is more interactionist view, that children's early word meaning are neither simply labels of the concept or nor constructed entirely because the language requires it, which is the hypothesis of Sapir-Whorf. Rather, they result from the interaction of existing cognitive development and the semantic categories. So, Bowerman and Choi review evidence on the acquisition of spatial terms and conclude that there are substantial similarities across languages. Now, Bowerman and Choi document considerable cross-linguistic variation in spatial terms. For example, English and Korean differ substantially. English makes a fundamental distinction between putting on and putting in. So we see that the distinction is very clear. Korean uses a term kita to mark a property that we are not familiar with in English. Whether two objects with complementary shapes fit together into an interlocking, tight-fitting relationship. Now, this applies to such disparate cases as putting a VHS tape in a cassette, putting a piece in a puzzle, stacking Legos, and putting a ring on a finger. Now, notice that in English, the first two of these would be considered putting in, and the other two putting on. So, the first two, which is basically the VHS tape and piece in puzzle, you use it as putting in, and this one would be putting on. In effect, Korean makes the distinction between putting things into tight containers or loose containers such as putting an apple in a ball. Choi and Bowerman compared early acquisition of spatial terms in Korean and English and found significant differences. Now, although both groups of children began using spatial terms around 14 to 16 months of age, they use spatial terms in different ways. English-speaking children distinguished between putting things into containers and putting them onto surface, but paid no attention to whether the object fit the container tightly or loosely. The Korean learners, in contrast, distinguished between tight and loose term. Another important study was about the frames, the linguistic frames. Now, Levinson is the one who has provided some support or suggested with regard to the linguistic frames. Now, the idea was to look at the spatial studies and see that, as Bowerman and Choi suggest, space is often regarded as universal, and studies results are suggestive. They are not necessarily conclusive because there is no correlation with non-linguistic cognition established. So, is there any evidence that a language's system of spatial terms influences the way a child thinks about space? Levinson contrasts three different frames of reference when talking about space. One is absolute, second is relative, and third is intrinsic. Absolute terms refer to the location of an object in space, irrespective of the location of a purpose or person, for example, north or south. Relative terms indicate the relationship between an object in the space and person, for example, in front of me or to the left of her. And intrinsic terms refer to objects in relation to various object coordinates such as behind the house, at the tip of the post, etc. All three are familiar to English speakers. To conclude, Korean and English differ in spatial terms, and children acquiring these languages appear to carve up reality in different ways. Languages also differ in the spatial frames of references. These frames of references influence performance on non-linguistic spatial tasks.